So today we'll be talking about Chapter 2, Section 2. And the title of this is An English Settlement at Jamestown. We've been talking about the Spanish colonial settlers for so long. Now it's time to transition to talking about the original 13 English colonies. And North Carolina, of course, is one of those. While one of the very first English colonies in the New World was in Virginia at Jamestown. This was the first English settlement in North America, founded in 1607. Now, Jamestown was a business venture. It was part of a joint stock company. That means that investors chose to put money into a colony in the hopes to get profits. That means the colony was not necessarily founded by the British government. It was actually founded by a private corporation. So if you've seen the movie Avatar, this is the real world version of Avatar. What was the purpose of Jamestown? To extract resources and gain profits for the company. Now, just like Avatar, the Jamestown colony was not going so well, for many reasons that we'll be exploring. Well, the company that founded Jamestown was called the Virginia Company. And the first 150 settlers arrived in 1607 to found this new English colony called Jamestown. It was located in what is today Virginia, on a small peninsula of the James River. Of these 150 settlers, there were soldiers, there were adventurers, and there were even indentured servants, as well as workers. It was mostly men, and they were all going there to stay permanently. Now, these colonists were going to seek adventure, hopefully get rich, because the rumors of these lands filled with gold and treasures. The city of El Dorado was an old legend of a city in the mysterious colony of the New World filled with gold. Or the legends of the Fountain of Youth in Ponce de Leon, or these legends of an untapped wilderness ripe for the taking. And so colonists were willing to leave everything behind. In some cases, these people were unwilling. Of course, slaves were brought to the New World. Laborers were brought. In some cases, they would go by and take everyone from the jails and move them to this colony. The continent of Australia was settled as a prisoners' colony. Britain decided they had too many prisoners. Their jails were full, so they said, hey, let's send them all to Australia. And that became the country of Australia. True story.
And then also Georgia, right?
Yeah, Georgia was a debtor's colony. We'll get to that in a little bit. But of these people who went to Jamestown, of the excitement and the adventure and the possibilities, most of them died from a million different things. Number one, it goes both ways. That Europeans were coming to the New World. They had not been exposed to many of the diseases here. In some cases, people starved to death. The colony of Jamestown was not very successful at first. And the only thing that kept this colony going was that once or twice a year, ships would arrive and bring new colonists and supplies. And they would bring, kegs and stores of food and more colonists and more seed to get farms started. So the investors were losing money on this venture. because it wasn't going so well. Well, the leader of Jamestown was named John Smith. I'm sure you've seen some movies about him, Pocahontas, and there have been several different movies made about this story. Well, John Smith believed that he could make Jamestown successful. But number one, the people were going to have to start farming. They were going to have to spend most of their time making this colony sustainable. And so he actually imposed a system of forced labor. Of all colonists were going to have to spend X amount of hours per day farming to make Jamestown work. Also, to make Jamestown work, the people in the colony were going to have to make friends with the native inhabitants, because Jamestown was going to need the help of the local natives, which were called the Powhatan people. And during the winter of 1609, Jamestown went through a very dark period. It was known as the starving time. The farms were not producing enough food to feed their people. 600 new colonists arrived on top of that, and so now they have to feed even more people. And on top of that, the goal of making friends with the natives was not going so well. And due to various clashes between the colonists and the natives, and the colonists thinking they could do whatever they wanted to the natives, the Powhatan would frequently raid the village of Jamestown, destroying their farms and contributing to this starving time. So when Jamestown made it through the starving time, as I said, new arrivals and more ships filled with supplies continued to come in. And though crops weren't growing extremely well, eventually farming operations were becoming more successful. But in regards to profits, Jamestown wasn't doing so well, because they were barely growing enough crops to survive and were not producing anything else of value at that time. But then, tobacco was discovered to be an enormously profitable crop that could grow in these tidewaters. And you see, Jamestown, Virginia is part of what we call a tidewater geography, meaning that these low-lying lands are often flooded and often filled with water. And many commercial crops don't grow so well in waters like that. Corn will drown. It just doesn't grow. Rots in the soil. Tomatoes will drown. Again, they literally rot, like the fruit falls off and dies and is no good. Okra, squash, potatoes, all of these things just fail in these tidewater types of climates. However, there are some types of crops that do quite well. Rice, oh my gosh, rice thrives in this type of environment. Tobacco thrives in this type of environment. And tobacco, of course, enormously profitable for a million different reasons. Tobacco became so profitable it was known as brown gold. And it became the #1 cash crop of Jamestown. In fact, by the 1620s, just a little over 10 years after the starving time, 1.5 million pounds per year of tobacco were being exported back to England. Now, Jamestown was becoming successful by the 1620s. And there was a system to encourage settlers to come to Jamestown. Because rumors did get back of how desperate and dark and despairing of a place this was, and how you were likely to die of numerous diseases or starvation or axed in the head by Indians or a million different things. But the Headright System encouraged settlers to go to the New World, because all you had to do was buy a ticket to get there, and you got a free 50-acre plot of land. A free 50-acre plot of land. Guys, that cost in the ballpark of $100,000 today. So, I mean, more than that, really. 50 acres is a lot of land, especially if it's good farming land. So, if you buy a ticket to get over there, you get a free, large farming plot of land. Now, that's pretty tempting to someone who doesn't have very much money. And so many people were coming over even without the money. They were coming over as indentured servants. Now, an indentured servant is someone who, hoping to take advantage of this Headright system, wants to get to the New World. But maybe they don't have any money. They don't even have money to buy the passage to get over here. And so what they would do is they would contract with a plantation owner in Jamestown who would sponsor their passage to the New World. And in exchange, they would work either 4 to 7 years, depending on the cost of their travel and the arrangement they reach with the landowner. And they would work for free, and at the end of that 4 or 7 years, they would get their own 50 acres. And I would assume that if you have folks that go back to this time period, they maybe came as indentured servants.
By 1616, the Virginia Company had transported more than 1,700 people to the Chesapeake and spent well over 50,000 pounds doing it, an immense amount of money for that century. Yet all they had to show for it was an unprofitable town inhabited by 350 diseased colonists. To stimulate immigration by propertied men, the company also introduced a concept called the Headright System.
So the idea of the Headright System was that for every servant you brought over or whose way you paid, you got 50 acres in Virginia. And servants also, because servants were said to be adventurers in person, you could be an adventurer in purse or in person, and a servant was an adventurer in person because he adventured or she adventured him or herself. They also were promised in the early years land when their term of servitude was up. And that was a lure that was beyond imagining, because none of those people would ever have become landowners in England.
As private property owners, rather than company employees, the colonists showed more initiative to grow their own crops.
And so after about a decade, they begin to hit on the right answer. And the answer that they hit on is the one that Sir Walter Raleigh actually had already come up with. So they do several things at the end of between 1618 and 1620. And what it all boils down to is that they realize that the way to get people to function is to allow them essentially to work for themselves. So they set up a system whereby property ownership becomes widespread. They give people an assembly. Purpose of the assembly is basically to decide on taxation for road building and fortifications and that kind of thing. And they remove the professional military men and put a citizen militia in its place. And it turns out that once you start doing those three things, colonies tend to work.
Secondly, in 1616, led by John Rolfe, the planters began to learn how to raise tobacco. King James at first made this statement about smoking.
It is a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs.
How right he was, but he soon learned to love the money England earned from tobacco. In 1638, 3 million pounds of tobacco was shipped from Virginia to England.
Tobacco was Virginia's gold, but once they began to plant tobacco, which coincided with the campaign to bring over large numbers of settlers, then actually Virginia became a thriving colony.
As tobacco plantations grew, the planters needed more land. land that came to them at the expense of the Indians' need for land. Having lost almost all their land, the Indians were confined on small reservations surrounded by colonial settlements. Disease and war reduced the Algonquin population from 24,000 in 1607, when the settlers arrived, to only 2,000 by 1669. The reduced Indian danger, the increased supply of farmland, and the profits of tobacco cultivation combined to attract growing thousands of immigrants from England. Emigration from England to Virginia more than doubled by the 1660s.
Now, the first Africans would arrive in North America in 1619. And these earliest Africans were treated as indentured servants, meaning that they would work for a period of time to pay for their passage and then they would be set free. However, by the late 1600s, plantation owners began to import slaves. Several reasons. Fewer indentured servants were coming in, and so this cheap source of labor was becoming less readily available. And as the colonies were becoming more wealthy, tobacco was a really stable cash crop. It was in high demand in England, and it could be easily grown in the colony of Jamestown. And so those landowners who had set up these large plantations were doing well for themselves and were able to afford importing slaves into the New World. Now, meanwhile, the English settlers did not intermarry with Native Americans. They did not live with Native Americans. They did not mix with the natives. And there were often hostilities and conflicts between the natives and the settlers, between the Powhatan, even after the starving time. The settlers did not get along with the Powhatan people because as more people were coming to Jamestown with the promise of the Headright System, each person who came over expected 50 acres of land to be given to them. And as the population of Jamestown increased, they continued to gobble up more and more land until, like the video, you saw that the natives were being pushed off of their own land to make way for these colonists. And this was a recipe for conflict. Now, in 1614, Pocahontas, a princess of the Powhatan people, married John Rolfe, the Jamestown plantation owner who had taught the people there how to grow tobacco. And this created a temporary peace. Now again, unlike the Disney movie, this was more of a political marriage, arranged between the chief of the Powhatan people and the leader of Jamestown, who saw a marriage as an opportunity to create peace and end the years of conflict that had been going on between the Powhatan peoples and the peoples of Jamestown. Even with this political marriage, violence continued because the population of Jamestown was growing, and with the Headright System, the colonists continued to expect plots of land. It was only fair, that's why they came here. Yet, this land was encroaching on the Powhatan people's home. And because of that, conflict continued until finally this joint stock venture, led by a private corporation, was taken over by the king, and Virginia became a royal colony under direct control of the King of England. Now, just like hostilities between the natives and the colonists, hostilities eventually develop between many of the former indentured people, the poor living in Jamestown, and the wealthy. You see, these former indentured servants often were given land on the frontier. So they would be given land far out of the city limits and simply told to settle and develop that land. Well, often this land belonged to Native American tribes, making their lives rather dangerous. Now, these indentured servants were not allowed to vote in their assemblies, so they had no say over what taxes would be levied on them. And since they had no say in their government, often they would be the ones forced to pay high taxes. Now, as I said, the frontier settlers, these former indentured servants who would be told, oh, by the way, your plot of land is way over there. And just so you know, there's a local tribe that thinks that's their land. Good luck with that. Yeah. Enjoy. I would build a big fence if I were you. And the Powhatans would frequently attack these frontier settlements, frequently killing their livestock. Now, another problem, not all settlers wanted to be farmers, and not all settlers were engaged in occupations that would benefit the whole colony. Many settlers were more interested in finding these legendary golden cities. And so they began to explore further and further out. And again, began to try to encroach on lands that belonged to others. The wealthier people in Jamestown were these plantation owners who could afford to live right within the city and have others work their farms. And as the frontier settlers began to complain to the local government in Jamestown about the natives attacking their settlements, and you see, the natives weren't necessarily murderers. They would attack and they would raid and they would tear up their farms as a warning. They weren't always just going in and killing everybody and knifing women and children, and like the rumors would suggest. Often they would just try to send a message, maybe set their crops on fire. A harsh message, yes, but the point was to try to tell them this is not your land. You need to go home. And the governor of Jamestown refused to provide resources to help the frontiersmen fight these natives. So, another great movie you should watch on this subject is Last of the Mohicans. It's set a little further, and we'll get to that topic in a few days. But it does deal with this issue of frontiersmen who are often under attack from a tribe of people known as the Mohawks. And that movie was actually filmed right here in Henderson County. In fact, the neat part at the end of the movie where the bad guy's fighting the good guy, and that was filmed at Chimney Rock. And so there's this part of the movie where people are falling off of Chimney Rock. So you totally got to watch it. It's pretty amazing. Now, Nathaniel Bacon, I know, don't we all love that name, right? Raised an army to fight these natives on the frontier. Now, you see, what makes Bacon's rebellion interesting, aside from the fact that, Bacon, we all love it, but what makes it interesting is that Nathaniel Bacon was one of these frontier settlers. He was just a man living in the middle of nowhere. He felt threatened from attacks by these natives, and so he called a meeting, not of the government in Jamestown. He called a meeting of other frontier settlers, and he said, it's time we defend our land. The government's not going to do it. Jamestown doesn't care about us. The king doesn't care about us. It's time we take matters into our own hands and stand up for our homes and family. And it was called Bacon's Rebellion because he wasn't a part of the government of Jamestown. He didn't have any authorization to do this. He did it entirely on his own. And in fact, the governor of Virginia called his army illegal. They said, you're not supposed to do that. And he said, well, what do you want me to do? We're getting attacked. What am I supposed to do? Am I allowed to, may I defend myself and my family now? Well, the governor said, No, you don't have the right to do that. So what did Bacon do? Well, Bacon, I just love getting to use that name, right? Anyway, Bacon takes matters into his own hands and sets fire to the colony of Jamestown. So they told him, no, you can't defend your own family. And I don't think that went over too well. I can just imagine, right? You know, Bacon stood up for itself. It's the only time you'll hear this story. And not only did Bacon stand up for itself, but it went and set fire to the capital of Virginia.
Mr. Witt, I can't